I still remember the first time someone whispered it loud enough for me to hear. Her child behaves like that because of her parenting. The words weren't just an insult. They were a punch to the chest. It was during a family gathering. My son, James, had just turned 3. He was flapping his hands excitedly because the ceiling fan fascinated him more than the toys scattered around the room. He wasn't saying much. He wasn't making eye contact. He wasn't answering when someone called his name. People noticed. They always do. But instead of compassion, what I got were opinions. Sharp, careless opinions. I pretended not to hear. But inside, something cracked. That evening, while putting James to sleep, I stared at his little face, wondering if I had truly failed him somehow. Did I spoil him? Was I too soft, too tired, too overwhelmed? These questions kept me awake for nights, eating at my confidence, until I finally gathered the courage to seek professional help, not because I believed the accusations, but because I loved my child enough to look for answers. And the answer was autism spectrum disorder. When the doctor said those words, I felt two things at the same time: fear and relief. Fear of the unknown, and relief because now I knew. It wasn't bad parenting. It wasn't my fault. My son wasn't broken or misbehaving. His brain was simply wired differently, beautifully differently. But the world around us didn't understand that. Not yet. From that day on, my life transformed. My days filled with therapies, appointments, research, and constant learning. And slowly, I changed not because I became a different mother, but because I finally understood the mother my child needed me to be. Yet the whispers continued. The blame didn't stop. And slowly, those whispers turned into comments. Comments turned into judgments. And judgments turned into labels. Labels not for my son, but for me. But this was only the beginning. The comments escalated when James started preschool. I was hopeful, too hopeful perhaps. I imagined a supportive teacher, patient classmates, and a learning environment where he could flourish. Instead, I walked into a battlefield disguised as a classroom. During the first week, his teacher pulled me aside with a polite but uncomfortable smile. "He doesn't listen, doesn't sit still, doesn't interact," she said. "You really need to control him at home." Control him? As if he were a machine with buttons I wasn't smart enough to find. I tried explaining his diagnosis, but she looked at me the way people do when they're listening only for the sake of politeness, not understanding, not caring. Soon, a few parents began avoiding me during pickups. Some openly complained that my child was disturbing theirs. One mother even suggested I should teach him discipline before sending him to school. Discipline. As if autism disappears with stricter rules. Every evening, I came home exhausted not from parenting, but from justifying my child's existence. The world kept telling me that my son was different in a way that made him difficult. But I learned to see him differently in a way that made him extraordinary. During therapy sessions, he learned to communicate with gestures. He learned to express joy by hugging tightly. He learned to show affection by placing his forehead on mine, a language only we understood. Every small milestone was a celebration. Every step forward was a victory. But society saw none of that. They only saw the moments when he struggled. And somehow, all those struggles pointed back to me. Bad parenting. 2 words strong enough to break a mother if she let them. But I didn't break. I bent, yes. I cried, yes, but I didn't break. Because every night, when James smiled at me with eyes that trusted me completely, I found the strength to stand again. And then came the day that changed everything. It happened unexpectedly. During a parent-teacher meeting, James was stimming, flapping his hands rhythmically while humming softly. A few parents stared, some frowned. And then a man, annoyed and impatient, said loudly, "Whose kid is this? Why can't you make him behave?" Something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. I stood up. "He is behaving," I said calmly, "just not the way you want him to." The room froze. I continued, my voice steady though my hands trembled. "My son is autistic. He's not misbehaving. This is how he copes with the noise, the crowd, the pressure. And instead of judging him or me, you could try understanding him." For the first time, people actually listened. I explained what stimming was. I explained sensory overload. I explained why autistic children don't always look at you when you speak, why they struggle with transitions, why they need patience, not punishment. I saw surprise in some eyes, embarrassment in others. But what mattered most was this. For the first time, I wasn't apologizing for my son. I was advocating for him. After that day, things began to shift. Slowly, yes, but genuinely. The teacher became more patient. A few parents asked questions instead of making assumptions. And I realized something powerful. People fear what they don't understand. But once you shine a little light, ignorance begins to shrink. I also realized something else: my voice matters. Not just for my child, but for every child who is misunderstood. Every parent who is silently blamed. Every mother who cries alone because society labels her before it listens to her. And that's when I made a promise. I would never stay silent again. Because silence lets the stigma grow. But voices change the world. But one more chapter remained. The chapter where I learned acceptance not from society but from my son himself. As the months passed, something beautiful unfolded, not in the world around us, but in the world inside our home. James began saying small words. He began responding to his name. He began expressing when he was overwhelmed. But the biggest change wasn't in his communication, it was in mine. I learned to see the world through his eyes. To him, the buzzing of lights wasn't background noise, it was thunder. Crowded rooms weren't social spaces, they were storms. A routine wasn't a preference, it was safety. The more I understood him, the more I understood how wrong people were. Autism wasn't bad behavior. Autism wasn't a parenting failure. Autism wasn't a tragedy. Autism was a language, and I simply had to learn it. I learned that when he flapped his hands, he wasn't being naughty, he was excited. When he avoided eye contact, he wasn't ignoring me, he was processing. When he played alone, he wasn't isolating himself, he was comfortable in his world. And slowly, wonderfully, he began inviting me into that world. Every time I joined him in lining up toys, every time I mimicked his humming, every time I sat next to him instead of dragging him into social interactions, he opened up more. And I realized that love doesn't always look like hugs and conversations. Sometimes love looks like accepting silence. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like learning, unlearning, and learning again. One evening, after a long day, he walked up to me, placed his tiny hand on my cheek, and said, "Mama, happy?" I couldn't answer for a moment. Tears filled my eyes. Because in that simple question, in that tiny voice, was the loudest truth. My child didn't need me to be a perfect parent. He needed me to be his parent. And that was enough. To society, stop labeling children. Stop blaming parents. Stop calling neurodiversity bad behavior. Autistic children are not difficult, they are different. They don't need judgment. They need understanding. They need environments that accommodate them, not condemn them. Your kindness can shape their world. Your ignorance can break it. Choose wisely. To special needs parents, you are not alone. Your child is not a burden. Your parenting is not a failure. Celebrate small victories. Advocate fearlessly. Love loudly. And remember, your child doesn't need a perfect parent, they need a patient, present, and understanding one. And that is more than enough.